Welcome to Imagine Otherwise, the podcast about the people and projects bridging art, activism, and academia to build better worlds. Episodes offer in-depth interviews with creators who use culture for social justice and explore the nitty-gritty work of imagining otherwise. I'm your host, Cathy Hannabach. This is episode 98, and my guest today is Fobazi Ettarh. Fobazi is the undergraduate success librarian at Rutgers Newark. Her identities as a first-generation American, queer, and disabled woman of color shapes her librarianship, which is guided by critical perspectives and the deconstruction of white supremacy. Creator of the concept of vocational awe, which we talk quite a lot about in the interview, Fobazi's research focuses on the tensions between the espoused values of librarianship and the realities present in the experiences of marginalized librarians and users. She also studies equity, diversity, and inclusion in libraries, specifically how social and organizational infrastructures privilege the work of certain groups over others. Fobazi is the author of the article Vocational Awe, The Lies We Tell Ourselves, as well as the blog WTF is a Radical Librarian Anyway, which examines issues at the intersections of librarianship, education, activism, and social justice. In our interview, Fobazi and I chat about what it actually means to be a radical librarian, how vocational awe limits solidarity options in libraries and academia, how progressive archivists and librarians of color are stitching critical race and feminist theory into the very fabric of knowledge repositories, and why demanding the impossible is a crucial way that Fobazi imagines otherwise. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
A lot of your recent work focuses on what you call vocational awe and the kind of power dynamics that are at work in any kind of library or archive space. I want to talk about vocational awe a lot in a minute, but first of all, maybe some of our listeners who aren't familiar with the term, can you give a little bit of a context of what do you mean by that and how does it shape library spaces?
So vocational awe is defined as the set of ideas, values, and assumptions librarians have about themselves and the profession that result in notions that libraries as institutions are inherently good and sacred and therefore beyond critique. So to break that down a little bit, the idea that libraries are inherently good because they provide access to all, have diverse collections, champion free speech. They're inherently sacred in that they are often named safe spaces, sanctuaries, sometimes even awe-inspiring. And finally, that libraries are beyond critique because they're the soul, quote unquote, of the community or the last bastions of democracy.
Hearing you describe this, there's so many connections to academia, right? This kind of this narrative of certainly a workplace being beyond critique, but also this emphasis on this isn't a job, it's a calling.
Yeah.
This kind of sacred calling that we have to teach or to do research or to work in library or archive spaces. So many connections here. And that it's really problematic, right? Because it hides a whole bunch of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. I definitely don't see vocational awe as just a library thing. I'm a librarian, and so that's the context that I work within, but I definitely see it in a lot of professions that are driven by missions rather than by practicality. Education is definitely another field where it's driven more by calling, social work. And the interesting thing is, and one that I definitely want to explore more, is that it tends to be very feminized fields that have a lot of this mission-driven rhetoric going through it. Nursing, being a teacher, being a social worker, being a librarian, they all are majority feminized fields. And so I do think that there is definitely something about the way gender plays a role that is interesting about vocational awe. If we're talking specifically about librarianship, the problem, right, with vocational awe is that, one, no field is beyond critique. Every institution exists within a white supremacist patriarchal society. And so ignoring that leads to marginalizing people. But by thinking of libraries as inherently good because they provide access to all, we ignore the fact that in many cases, the policies show that they're not actually giving access to all people. The undesirable, whether it be back in the time of segregation, where libraries weren't open to Black people, or now with the policies against the homeless or the mentally ill, any population that is seen as undesirable, the policies are used against them. If we're saying that libraries are inherently sacred because they're safe spaces or sanctuaries, it's the same thing. They're only safe spaces for the privileged and sanctuaries for those who are deemed worthy. And again, to say that the field is beyond critique because it is the last bastion of democracy, when it in fact upholds and continues to uphold white supremacy and ignores valid critiques, actually in and of itself chips away at the democratic values that libraries espouse to hold.
I'm curious what kinds of connections or maybe solidarity opportunities we can find or that you've explored in your work between, say, faculty, graduate students, librarians, archivists, community folks, readers, to create library spaces or archive spaces that are not run through vocational awe.
Yeah, I think the biggest way to start to deconstruct vocational awe is one, to understand that it exists, right? You can't fight a problem unless you know it's there. And two is to actually start to work together in dismantling this concept. Vocational awe is so dangerous in a lot of ways because it isolates everyone into specific bubbles. And because no one's actually working together, everyone's trying to do everything all the time. So a librarian is trying to be a social worker, be a lawyer, be an accountant, right? Help with all of these problems that are happening that the students are bringing to them. Same thing, a faculty is not only helping with the academic part, but often taking on that student support service role as well, because no one's actually talking to each other because they believe, as you said, it's a calling. So whatever problems that they are seeing or encountering, it's their duty to fix it themselves. By working together and actually talking to the other departments and units on campus, we can start to shoulder the complex problems together rather than burning out as we try and solve everything by ourselves.
I'm curious how this works with unionization, because I think your point about these groups, particularly on college campuses, but I'm sure there are analogous examples elsewhere, is these groups are kept quite apart, right? Both in their daily work, their community work, how they're treated by administration, and by how they're unionized or not unionized, right? Particularly in the case of adjuncts. I wonder if there's potential there, maybe strategies there, or maybe even is there a reason why librarians are often in a different union than the adjuncts, who are in a different union than the tenure track faculty, who are in a different union than the graduate students, right? It seems like there are these structural barriers to this kind of collaboration.
Yeah, I definitely think that unionization is a way to start to dismantle vocational awe. To your question, right, as to why all of these units are in different union structures and the structural barriers to working as a collective. I mean, white supremacy in general wants to make sure that everyone is siloed and no one is talking to each other, because that is how power can continue to be kept by the few instead of by the many. And so I definitely think that physical unions, right, actually unionizing is definitely a way to start to dismantle vocational awe. But also, if unionization isn't possible, right, you're in a right to work state or other legal and social barriers to physical unionization, starting to think of yourselves as a collective is one way to start to build those bridges and therefore understand that, again, you don't have to do it all by yourself. There are people here, either in your department or on campus or in your organization, that are there to help you. Things like overwork and burnout happen partly because there are no structures in place to alleviate that. And so working together with the other people in your unit or department or organization, whatever it may be, and just saying, hey, we are all going through the same thing. If we decide as a group that we are not going to answer emails on the weekends, for an example, right, then an administration can't point to any one person and say, oh, but Leslie, she answers emails at 2 a.m. She answers emails on a Sunday. Why can't you be more like Leslie, right? There's no Leslie to use as a leverage point to continue to marginalize people.
I want to talk more about kind of how this taps into your broader approach to librarianship and to kind of knowledge productions. And I think turning to your blog actually might be a really good way to do this. Your blog has one of the best titles I think I've come across. It's called WTF is a Radical Librarian. First of all, is there a story behind that title?
It was a little bit of a cheeky way to demonstrate what I and some of the other people of color in my network, specifically women of color, have felt in terms of the discrepancies between espoused values of librarianship, of academia, and the realities of it. So often, especially when you are the type of person who speaks out, the idea of a person of color speaking out is really desirable by organizations because they want to tokenize you. Like they say, look, we have this person, not only is she a person of color, but she speaks out and is trying to make the field better. She's great for her bottom line for equity, diversity, and inclusion. However, once you're in the organization, then all of those things that they use to promote their EDI work to other universities, to other spaces becomes problematic. Like, we wanted you to speak out, but not about our institution. We wanted you to speak up, but now you're doing it too much. We wanted you to be loud, but now that you're here, your loudness is being translated as anger. And so it's just like, you want a radical librarian, but you don't. So like, WTF is a radical librarian then. So that's sort of how it came about.
I'm curious about the kind of radical social justice tools or frameworks that I know you bring to your work as a librarian, but also that you work to ensure that other libraries and archive spaces help to embody. So maybe what are some of the tools or frameworks that you've drawn from social justice movements that you want to see more libraries encompass?
That's a great question. So currently, I'm writing a book chapter with two other librarians, Anastasia Chu and Jenny Ferretti, about how the concept of neutrality intertwine with vocational awe to uphold white supremacy. And that chapter is part of critical race theory in library and information science, which is being published by MIT Press sometime in 2020. And I think that critical race theory is definitely one of the frameworks that librarianship would definitely benefit from using. It not only talks about what is whiteness, which anyone who does sort of social justice work knows can be hard for people to grasp the fact that it's not the shark, but the water. Most people think of whiteness and racism and, insert any ism here as the most egregious example, the extreme example, someone being called the N-word or someone taking someone's wheelchair away or, whatever it might be. And so all of the points up until that extreme example are dismissed as, maybe you misheard, or maybe you misunderstood, or you should assume good intentions, or whatever the reasons that people use to ignore and defend white supremacy and isms that come with it. Frameworks like critical race theory, feminist theory, queer theory begin to peel back the layers of all of these structures, both explicit and implicit, that uphold white supremacy within the organization, within the unit, within the campus. Not only that, starts to show the place of the margins not as something to be pitied, but also a place of strength. Gloria Anzaldúa and her Borderlands Mestiza framework is another one that I thought was really interesting because, again, she uses these margins not as a place of weakness, but as a place where you can really see how to make the organization or the world or whatever it might be a better place.
What are some of your favorite actual radical librarian projects or spaces that you see kind of embodying critical race theory and feminist theory and queer theory, these kinds of forms of intersectional analysis and critique that we want to see more broadly taken up? What are some of your kind of favorite projects that are doing this kind of work?
Well, as I mentioned, one of my co-authors, Jennifer Ferretti, she's one of my favorite radical librarians. She actually, with Charlotte Rowe and Jennifer Brown, created the counter space We Hear. And We Hear is a space only for people of color, and that is enforced. It's not people of color and their white husbands or wives or brothers or sisters. It's very clearly only a space for people of color, which I think is really important, especially because we're only 10 to 15% of the field. And so it can be a space where those counter narratives can begin, counter storytelling can begin, as well as a place where you can commiserate these stories about your daily lives, whether it be microaggressions, all of the examples of white supremacy and how it impacts the micro and macro without necessarily having to explain why it's a microaggression or why it's white supremacy, right? All of that background knowledge is already there, and therefore it can actually be things about solutions, moving beyond the 101, in other words. Another person, the two people who actually are the editors and masterminds behind the critical race theory in library and information science book, Sophia Leung and Jorge, I cannot remember his last name right now, but they are definitely two radical librarians whom I really respect. April Hathcock and Charlotte Rowe, again, from the person who was one of the admins for the We Hear space. They are doing great things for scholarly communication, getting publishers to see how white their collections are, how whiteness really informs whom they accept as book proposals or articles, and how to begin to change that in terms of archives. Rachel Winston, she's the Black diaspora archivist in Austin. She is doing amazing work with decolonizing archives and special collections. There's so many. Again, like, I think one of the positives about being someone who lives in the margins is that you really can create a network of people who are doing similar things to what you're doing and working together to slowly radicalize the field in whatever aspect that might be in.
I'm curious how you see your work in all of these kinds of projects, bringing together your interest in academia, in art, or kind of creativity, critical thinking, and social justice activism. What draws you to that nexus?
I won't lie, part of it is the fact that I feel like I have to, right? Once you start to see all the discrepancies, it's a lot harder to ignore the unfairness of it all, the inequalities that you're seeing on the day-to-day basis. But for me, in terms of all these intersections with art and activism and academia, I'm also just interested in these spaces in general. My mom is an educator, so education was always something that drew me. My partner has her PhD in communication, specifically focusing on how users influence the industry and vice versa. And so even seeing in things like popular culture how people can influence and actually change the industry, these systems put in place to marginalize, is so fascinating to me.
So this brings me to my absolute favorite question that I get to talk with folks about, and it gets at that big why behind all of these kinds of varied projects that you're involved with. And that's that version of a better world that you're working towards. And so I will ask you this giant question, but I think it's an important question that we often don't get enough opportunities to talk with each other about, especially when we have to spend so much of our time fighting. So what kind of world do you want?
It is a giant question, but an amazing one. One of my favorite authors, N.K. Jemisin, she wrote the Broken Earth trilogy. She's a speculative fiction writer. In The Stone Sky, which is one of her books, she says that there are stages to the process of being betrayed by your society. One is jolted from a place of complacency by the discovery of difference, by hypocrisy, by inexplicable or incongruous ill treatment. What follows is a time of confusion, unlearning what one thought to be truth, immersing oneself in the new truth, and then a decision must be made. And now I'm going to paraphrase. Before was a direct quote. So the decisions are either accepting your fate, right, swallowing your pride, doing your best to assimilate despite whatever harm that might be inflicted on you. One is to demand the impossible, to say, this isn't right, we have to change it. We are not inferior, whoever we are. We do not deserve what's happening to us. Then the only way there can be peace is through conflict. I know that conflict can be kind of a four-letter word when we talk about it, because conflict is seen as inherently violent. And I don't necessarily disagree that conflict isn't violent, but I think that in order to get to that better world where there isn't a population or peoples that are treated badly, that are subjugated, that are marginalized, I think that it requires a total shifting of the paradigm in which we currently live. So that perfect world, that better world, the one that we're hopefully moving towards, even if it is in a slightly meandering way, that better world is one where the marginalities of people, we don't have to necessarily take power from the margin because there are none. It's great that we on the margins are starting to see it as a place of strength rather than a place of subjugation, but a better world would mean that there was no subjugation happening. A better world would mean that we wouldn't have to speak softly in order to make changes to pacify those in power. It would mean that changes wouldn't be seen as inherently violent. Too often, conflict, that four-letter word, is seen as synonymous with change, in that any change is conflict. And in a better world, change would be embraced, not seen as divisive, not seen as trying to hurt someone. Going to the metaphor, equality is not pie, right? There's no taking away. If equity is to occur, it's not pieces of pie. As people from the margins take more equity, it doesn't mean that there's less equity for everyone else. Rather, it is hopefully a renewable resource, one that will never run dry. That is obviously a long way from now and perhaps idealistic, but when I think of a better world, that's what I think of, a place where change is embraced, where those people work as a collective rather than working in opposition to each other and to one's own interests oftentimes, and a place where conflict isn't seen as a four-letter word, but as a fulcrum to a better time, a better organization, a healthier world and place.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing all of the ways that you imagine and create otherwise.
Thank you for having me. This was super fun to be a part of.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Imagine Otherwise. Imagine Otherwise is produced by Ideas on Fire, and this episode was created by Michelle Velasquez-Potts and myself, Cathy Hannabach. You can check out the show notes for this episode on our website at ideasonfire.net, where you can also read about our fabulous guest, as well as find links to the people and projects discussed on the show.